Well, time for the View, looking at the opinion pages of today's newspapers. In the Daily Telegraph, Theresa May's former advisor, Nick Timothy, issues a rallying cry for Conservatives to back Boris Johnson or face certain defeat by Jeremy Corbyn. Similar in the Times, Robert Colville of the Centre for Policy Studies says amid the hysteria, it's worth remembering that there's nothing unscrupulous in honouring the referendum result. The Prime Minister is actually fighting to save, not wreck, democracy. Matthew Dancona in The Guardian disagrees. He says Boris Johnson is wrecking the Tory party at astonishing speed, and without MPs like Amber Rudd, the party can't survive. The Conservative Party is being hacked down in Ben Jennings' cartoon in The Guardian as the Prime Minister takes a chainsaw to anything that gets in his way. Boris Johnson is floored by a girly swat, a reference to his attack on David Cameron that was revealed last week as the former Work and Pensions Secretary, Amber Rudd, hits him with her resignation letter. Never mind Margaret Atwood's new novel, a continuation of The Handmaid's Tale, for a really terrifying vision of the future. Blower's cartoon in The Telegraph has an aged Boris Johnson continuing to fight with Jeremy Corbyn over whether to hold an election sometime in the future. Writing in the Daily Mail, the Culture Secretary Nicky Morgan says Boris Johnson needs to show he's serious about getting a Brexit deal and must be more transparent in dealings with Brussels. In the Eye, Ian Birrell bemoans plasticine politicians like, he says, Matt Hancock, who he believes are poisoning democracy. And in The Guardian, John Harris asks why, with such a stark choice in front of them, are so many people in the UK just exhausted, tuning out instead of engaging with politics? Well, join me to go through those today are Benedict Spence, the writer, and the contributing editor at Novara Media, Dalia Gabriel. Welcome to you both. Now, Benedict Spence, before we were interrupted by a couple of Prime Ministers, I was asking about the defences being put out today by both Robert Colville and Nick Timothy of Boris's position, saying he's the one really standing up for democracy.
Well, I mean, if you were to just take the argument about democracy to one side, I mean, we need to remember that when Theresa May became leader, there was this great campaign, anybody but Boris. Well, that opinion has shifted completely within the Conservative Party because I think there is an understanding now that perhaps to go to the later article about plasticine politicians, there is a complete dearth of politicians in the Conservative Party who are capable of winning a general election. Boris Johnson, as the polls certainly suggest, or at least they did until Amber Rudd's resignation, he certainly has that bit of ability to cut through what many people see as sort of quite shapeless Tory politicians. And I think the key thing to remember is ultimately, he retains a lot of the support of the members and of the general public. And yes, actually, Robert Colville is right. There's nothing really wrong with trying to see through the argument for actually seeing through the referendum result. If I were to pinpoint one example as to why I think Boris Johnson will survive, I'd say look no further than Jeremy Corbyn's own success.
Right, Dalia. What about on this strict point of Brexit? Is Boris Johnson doing the right thing?
So I think that essentially what we have is a kind of existential split in the Conservative Party. I don't think it's just about Boris Johnson, although I do think, Boris Johnson has lost every single challenge that has been mounted to him since he became Prime Minister. So there is a unique issue with Boris Johnson's mode of governing, that he has no allies. The way he's done politics means he doesn't really have those kind of long-term allies within the Tory party. So I essentially think that part of it is an existential split within the Tory party, part of it is Boris Johnson's own central incompetence, and part of it is also the impossibility of reconciling the question of the Irish border and leaving the customs market, the customs union and the single market. It's not just a legal technicality. It's actually quite an existential contradiction.
Well, it is a problem, but I mean, the argument of these pieces is saying the
UK.
basic thing is there was a referendum, there was a decision, and Johnson's delivering that, and everybody, including Jeremy Corbyn, the other opposition parties, and the Amber Rudds of this world are basically trying to put a spoke in the wheel.
I think that this has revealed a really important question that has been under the surface, which is that democracy has not been working for a very long time in this country. Politicians have not been accountable for a very long time. I don't think it's just coming to head in the referendum. And I think that the question of who owns our democracy, how politicians can be accountable, and who runs our democracy is kind of reflected in how we have this very ineffective referendum where the choices were not very clear. We have yes and no, but what that no to membership of the EU looked like was very unclear.
I think if we were to come on to one of the later pieces, which is Matthew Ancona's argument that the Conservative Party is essentially being destroyed, the key thing I think that he perhaps misses is that a political party can only represent the people who are going to vote for it. If there aren't people that are going to vote for it, there's no point in having that political party. That's an issue that Labour have been coming to terms with over the past few years, and the Tories are now catching up to them. We had the emergence of the Brexit Party, which my opinion was they happened to just be UKIP 2.0. That's not necessarily to say that they would ever win any seats, but they did provide a threat. They represented a strain of thought in this country that wasn't being represented. And what Boris Johnson is doing now is taking the Conservatives over towards that group of the electorate. And certainly the polls, again, I hate to go back to it, they certainly suggest that he's not wrong to do that.
Well, except, I mean, I was fascinated as ever by Nick Timothy, you know, logic saying, well, actually, the Peel, the splitter in this context is not Boris Johnson, it's the Remainer or the pro-European rebels within the Conservative Party. But, you know, the point about that is Peel may have given up his career, but actually he won the argument. So if the Amber Rudds of this world, the people calling for withdrawal with a deal, are Robert Peel, they're going to win.
Well, we wait to see whether or not that will happen. I think it's very interesting that Nicky Morgan, however, has come out and said today that we need to be prepared to leave without a deal, even though she would like one. And I think that's the key problem here, is how hard, so to speak, are you prepared to go for no deal? Because ultimately it is now a game of brinksmanship. It's always been a game of brinksmanship with the European Union. And if you do have people undermining your position, you do sell yourself slightly short. Most people want a deal, but you can't actually just go into these negotiations saying, we will have a deal at all costs and we're not prepared to walk away.
And that, in a sense, is the corner which the government or the government Conservatives believe they've got Jeremy Corbyn in, that he's now ruling out no deal.
Well, I mean, I think it's completely reasonable to rule out no deal. The idea of leaving the EU without a deal was unimaginable during the time of the referendum. I don't think anyone voted for the idea of leaving Europe without a deal. On the contrary, we were told by the Leave campaign that a deal would be done so quickly and that, you know, it would be so easy and that we hold all the power, we hold all the leverage. And getting stuck in, years later, we've realised that that's not the case. And I think one thing that I think a lot of the sort of hard leave politicians that are sort of batting around this idea of no deal is they're relying on this conception that people have that a no deal Brexit would mean a kind of clean break. It would mean an end to this endless sort of boring and tedious discussions over Brexit. It's the complete and exact opposite. Leaving the EU without a deal would not only mean a complete disruption in our logistics and infrastructure, which isn't a matter of an opinion, it's bread and butter issues, but it would mean a kick-starting of a whole new wave of processes to clean up the mess in terms of negotiation
yet again,
with the
you've
EU.
got John Harris,
in order
who's
to
certainly a
leave.
journalist who stays out of the Westminster bubble. He was in Bury last week, he tells us. And you know, people there, Labour heartlands, are just saying, we just want this over. We want it done. And they see leaving without a deal, if necessary, at the end of October, a way of doing that, even if it isn't.
But I do think that that is an issue, and that is a kind of line that I think the Leave campaign has sold, which is this idea that leaving without a deal means getting this over and done with. We all want to get this over and done with. We're all bored of it. We're all finding it extremely tedious. It's stopping us from developing the country and developing our ideas for what we want the future of Britain to be in any other way. But a no-deal Brexit would be the start of a whole nother phase of intricate chaos. It would be Brexit swallowing up our political landscape for the next decade. A deal is a much neater way of leaving, but it seems like the desire to leave the customs union and the single market and the composition of our constitution is not compatible.
I don't disagree with you. I think that a no-deal Brexit would be very difficult, but I think this line of arguing, line of questioning, is part of the problem as to why we now have massive disengagement in politics, which is that it doesn't matter to most people how difficult it's going to be. They voted for it. and they're not being listened to. And this is the thing you can
didn't
keep
vote
on.
for a no deal.
This is the thing. Well, you say
They
that,
didn't
but let's
vote for a no
also
deal.
bring back to the fact
That
that
was unimaginable
no,
at the
it was
time.
not unimaginable.
It was
During the referendum
absolutely
campaign, there were two
unimaginable.
separate Leave campaigns, one infinitely more hardline than the other one, precisely because there were two strains of thinking. This idea that it was everybody was saying, oh, it's absolutely going to be sunny uplands,
There were
that's
two
not
strains of
true. We have
thinking.
to remember
The strains
that.
of thinking.
That's repainting history. And the point is, going back to this, about a lack of interest now in politics and people becoming very fed up, is simply because they're not being listened to. And we have to remember the referendum was the single largest democratic event in this country's history, and the majority that won 3 years later are not being listened to.
The different
Obviously,
strains
people are
were
going to
in
be
whether or not
very angry
we
about
do a
that.
soft Brexit or a harder Brexit deal, whether we leave the single market or we don't leave the single market. At no point did anyone sell the idea of leaving, of crashing out of the EU, and especially
people did.
crashing out of the EU by a government that has clearly not made the logistical preparations
Plenty
for
of
that.
people made that argument.
Okay.
They were just
That's
the ones
not the
that you
case.
chose to listen
No,
to.
that's not
All
the
right.
case.
Thank
In
you
terms of
both very
mainstream
much
voices,
indeed. Good to see you. This is All Out Politics. Coming up next,